Thank you. Okay, so Boker Tov, everyone. Good morning. I decided that 3 days before Shavuot, we probably should talk a little bit about the fundamentals of our Torah Shebe'al Peh, which is the Mishnah and the Talmud, and obviously their relations to Torah itself. What I would like to do today is to really take you through a journey of history and development. And what do I mean by that? Obviously, we received the Torah from Sinai. I'm not going to get into what exactly, how. This is not the topic of the shiur. My topic is that the development of Torah Shebe'al Peh, how it evolved, what exactly were the fundamentals, what were the trends in society, what was considered as important or scholarly work that people did, and then to see how the rabbis tried to somehow balance it. So this is a long introduction, and let's start. So I'll share it. Everyone can see it. I'll make it a bit bigger. Is that large enough? Pretty good. Okay. So
a little bigger, yeah, a little bigger. When you get older, you get difficulties.
Is that okay? Like that? That's, I think, the biggest I can. Yeah. Here we go. Okay, that's probably the largest I can do. Okay. So the Gemara says, here. Good. Good. Okay. So the Gemara says in Baba Metzia in Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph Amud Bet, and we will read it first, and then we will read it with Rashi and see what can we learn from it. So the Gemara says like that, Tanu Rabbanan. So the Gemara brings a braita. Our Oskim Bamikra, those who are engaged with the narrative itself, with the psukim, Midah ve'eina midah. What does it mean, Midah ve'eina midah? So even without looking at Rashi, that we will see in a minute, it seems to be that it's like, as we say in Hebrew, kacha kacha, right? Or French, comme ci, comme ça. It's not like a scholarly work. And Rashi immediately says, midah hi ktsat ve'eina midah. So it's a bisala, it's a little of an attribute, but it's not exactly the best thing. Why? שהמשנה ותלמוד יפים ממנה. Because Mishnah and Talmud is much better learning or studying than just read the Chumash. And then he says, interesting enough, why is it? Why Mishnah and Talmud are more important than spending your time thinking about just the Mikra, the narrative? So Rashi says, מפני שתלויים בגרסה ומשתכחים. Because everything is by memorization. שבימיהם, because in the time of the Talmud, לא היה גמרא בכתב. They didn't have a Talmud in writing. It was all בעל פה, it was all orally. וגם לא היה ניתן לכתוב. And also it was prohibited to what? To write it down. אלא לפי שנתמעטו הלבבות, but because our memory capacity became low and we were not able to remember as well, and also there are צרות and we couldn't concentrate, התחילו דורות אחרונים לכותבו. So later generations start writing the Gemara. So if I would pause here for just a second, why is it that the Mishnah and Talmud has some kind of importance over the narrative? Answer is because the narrative is there for everyone. You don't need to really put too much effort in order to remember it. Because if you forget, you just go to the book and you open the book. However, Mishnah and Talmud requires chazara, requires memorization, requires some kind of repetition. So you are really more engaged, and that's what it basically gave it. What it gave it its importance. Now that's a very interesting thing. Basically, you are telling me that Torah Shebe'al Peh, Mishnah and Talmud are somewhat even more important than the what? Than Mikra, than the Torah Shebichtav. because it requires more memorization. Now, interesting. Also, Rashi says that in their time, the Gemara was not written. When he says their time, what time are we talking about? Only the time of the Tanaim, the Amoraim. What are we talking about? So, little bit of history. Even Rebbe, when we say Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi wrote the Mishnah, probably, he didn't really wrote a Mishnah. He edited most of the Masorot, most of the traditions of Tanaim, and created what we call a kovetz, a file, which basically created later on the basis, the structure for the Talmud and everything else. The Tosefta, we're not going to talk about it now. We are not now in a Talmud shiur in the academia, not now. Maybe I will mention some little later on. But basically what we have is that it seems to be that, at least according to Rashi, the reason to write Torah Shebe'al Peh was because really people start, I don't know, were not that involved or didn't have the time or didn't have the capacity or the cognitive abilities to repeat and to remember and to memorize. And therefore, if someone who is capable is reading Psukim instead of engaged in Mishnah and Talmud, he is not going to get a brownie point. It's midah ve'eina midah. And then, b'mishnah, if someone is engaged in Mishnah, so midah ve'notlim alea sachar. It is something, and you also get some reward for it. But Talmud, ein lecha midah gdola mizo. If someone is engaged in Talmud, this is the greatest thing. Now, before we go into the contradiction in a second, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says Talmud. What does it mean, Talmud? Talmud is not necessarily, taking a Baba Metzia. Talmud, כבר פירשתי למעלה, I already explained above, שהוא לתת לב להבין סתימות טעמי המשנה מה הם, is to try to understand the contradictions in the Mishnah, to try to reconcile things that seems to be in odd with each other, and to understand the reasons of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a very apodictic style of writing, which means they give halachot, they don't give reasons. It's what they call kazuisti, which means you have a case, you have a law, and there are almost no reasons or reason even to the law, to the halacha. And the Gemara, that means what? You need to try to figure out the reasons behind it. וכששתיים סותרות זו את זו, and when you have one Mishnah says yes and the other Mishnah says no, יבין לתרץ שיהיו שתיהן קיימות, so he will know how to try to reconcile it so both Mishnayot will exist or coexist, או לדעת דברי התנאים החלוקים בדבר, or at least to know the dispute between the Tanaim on that specific case, ונאמן, you should say, המאני פלוני חכמו, meaning you have two ways to reconcile Mishnayot, to come up with a innovative and creative solution to try to merge the Mishnayot and to reconcile them, or alternatively, to say, look, there is a debate between this Tana and this Tana, and this Mishnah that says yes, that's Rabbi Meir, and this Mishnah that says no, that's Rabbi Shimon. Now, so if I would ask you, for now, what is the highest level of learning? You will say what? Talmud. Second, Mishnah. Third, Mikra. Everyone is with me? Okay, get ready. The Braita says, ולעולם הווה רץ למשנה יותר מן התלמוד. Now, you don't need to be, we don't need to have any background to understand that that contradicts everything we said before. It says, look, Mikra is midah ve'eina midah, Mishnah is midah ve'mekablim alea sachar, Talmud, that's the greatest. But then It says what? You should run for the Mishnah and not for the Talmud. But we just said what? What is the highest level of learning? Talmud. So how can you tell me that I should run to learn Mishnah? It's like telling me to run for the second place rather than to the first place. Okay. So the Gemara says exactly our question. Haguf akashya. That's exactly our problem. Amart betalmud en lecha midah gdola mizo. You said that Talmud is the greatest thing ever. Ve'adar amart, and then later on you said leolam everatzta mishnah yoter min Talmud. So I have a contradiction. What's the contradiction? On one hand, you are telling me Talmud is the greatest. On the other hand, you tell me no, Mishnah is the greatest. You should run for the Mishnah. But the Gemara says like that. Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan was one of the greatest Amoraim in Eretz Israel in the 3rd century. He says, B'yimei Rebbe nishnet Mishnah azu, shav kukule alma matnitin, ve'azlu batar talmuda. Says Rashi, B'yimei Rebbe nishnet Mishnah azu. Take a look. Rashi is giving us a piece of history, which is very uncommon. Take a look. Rashi says like that. What does it mean that this Mishnah was written or was said at the time of Rebbe? Hadektani, what it says, Talmud ein lecha midah gdola mizo, when it says that the greatest thing to learn is Talmud, why is it? Lefi shemisherabu talmidei Shammai veHillel, because there are many Talmidim of Shammai and Hillel, שהיו לפניו 3 דורות, that they came before Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, 3 generations before Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. רבו מחלוקות בתורה ונעשית כשתי תורות. So there are too many debates, too many machlokot, and the Torah looked like 2. Because Bet Shammai says one thing, Bet Hillel says the other thing, so everyone did whatever they want. מתוך עול שעבוד מלכויות וגזרות שהיו גוזרים עליהם, and because there were so many persecutions against the Jewish people, because don't forget, 70, the destruction of the Second Temple, 135, the destruction of Mered Bar Kokhba, so there are many persecutions. ומתוך כך, and because of that, לא היו יכולים לתת לב לברר דברי החולקים עד ימיו של רבי. Until Rebbe's time, the rabbis couldn't really figure out how to reconcile all those disputes. They didn't have the menuchat hadat, the tranquility, to sit and to really understand what's going on. Until when? Until the days of Rebbe, שנתן הקדוש ברוך הוא חן לא חן בעיני אנטינונוס מלך רומי, that he found favor with the Roman general or Caesar, כדאמרינן בעבודה זרה, ונחו מצרה, and he was able to secure safety and security for the Jewish people, and he had time. So what did he do with his time? He started his enterprise to try to understand how to reconcile all the Mishnayot together. So what did he do? ושלח וקיבץ כל תלמידי ארץ ישראל. He sent letters and he asked every scholar in Eretz Israel to come, ועד ימיו לא היו מסכתות סדורות. Until his days, they didn't have what we have today. Baba Metzia, Baba Kama, Sanhedrin, Avodah Zarah, Brachot, Shabbat, Eruvin. אלא, but rather, what did they have? כל תלמיד ששמע דבר מפי גדול ממנו גרסה. Every Talmud that heard from someone who is greater than him, he heard something, he repeated it. He started remembering it. ונתן סימנים, and he gave signs in order to remember it. הלכה פלונית ופלונית שמעתי משום פלוני. So I heard this halacha from this rabbi, this halacha from the other rabbi. וכשנתקבצו, and when they gathered together, when Rabbi called them for a conference, אמר כל אחד מה ששמע. So each one of them repeated what he heard from his Rabbi, ונתנו לב לברר טעמי המחלוקת, and they paid attention to try to clarify all those contradictions. דברי מי ראוין לקיים, who should be accepted and who should be rejected. וסידרו המסכתות, and they organized it based on files. נזיקים, זרעים, מועד, נשים, קודשים, טהרות, דברי נזיקים לבדם, דברי יבמות לבדם, דברי קודשים לבדם. So they start organizing it like in files. וסתם נמי במשנה דברי יחידים, and then Rabbi decided to what? To, in the Mishnah, to insert halachot, specific halachot with no names, so it will be accepted above all. שראה רבי את דבריהם ושנען סתם כדי לקבוע הלכה כמותם. לפיכך אמרו בגמרא, אין לך מידה גדולה מזו שיתנו לב לטעמי המשנה. So basically what Rabbi Yochanan says, according to Rashi, which is, by the way, fascinating. By the way, how do you think Rashi knows this piece of history? Is everyone with me with what Rashi said? Okay, how do you think he knows that?
He probably heard it from his father, his grandfather, his great grandfather. There had to be a Masorah that carried forward the discussion.
It might be that he had some kind of a tradition, but none of them were there. Okay, we're talking about Rebbe. That's the end of the 2nd century. Rashi is in the 11th century. I will doubt that he has a tradition from his parents, grandparents until the time of Rebbe. Would be almost impossible.
Is any of this recorded elsewhere in the Gemara?
In the Gemara, not exactly. Who is the first one to tell us anything about Shalshelet HaKabbalah? Very famous.
Pirkei Avot.
Now, there, I need to clarify my question. Not Shalshelet HaKabbalah, but who were the rabbis who carried the Jewish people on their shoulders?
Gaonim.
Geonim. What Gaon do you remember? Igeret Rav Shri Gaon. Okay, Igeret Rav Shri Gaon is a letter from Rav Shri Gaon in the time of the Geonim. Time of the Geonim is between 6th, 7th century until the beginning of the 11th century, and he wrote a letter describing names of rabbis in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, Amoraim, Stamaim, basically telling the Shoel, the person who asked him, tell him all the history of the Talmud until his days. This letter, this Igeret, was a well-known Igeret, and it perhaps that Rashi saw it and spoke about it. However, no one knows exactly how those Mishnayot were brought into Rebbe's Beit Midrash, and also we don't know what exactly Rebbe did with them. Was he an activist? Did he change them? Did he edit them? Or he was very passive in his editing job. He just basically, he heard this Talmud says, oh, this is what my Rebbe said. Okay, I put it in. Or he said, no, I don't think so. I should edit it. I should reject it. Who gave him authority to reject one opinion over another? Basically what we have, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan says, when we have this idea that Talmud, ein lecha midah gdola mizo, that the highest level of learning is Talmud, that was said in the time of Rebbe. Meaning after Rebbe established those files of all these Mishnayot, now when you have the file, what do you have? Contradictions. Because this is the first time in history, that oral Torah is being brought to one place. Before that, all the oral Torah was not spread all over. It was always centralized where? In the Sanhedrin. But now there is no Sanhedrin. Everyone does whatever his Rebbe tells him. So basically what Rebbe is doing at the end of the 2nd century is what? Is basically bringing all the Masorot, all the traditions that he was able to gather, create files, and now they are analyzing the files. So they need to reconcile the contradictions. They need to understand the reasons behind it. So he gets, and he says, everyone should go and learn Talmud. Now, what does it mean, Talmud? Talmud does not mean to learn this book. Okay, it does not mean to learn this book. There's no Talmud Bavli. There are rabbis who are now creating it. How? By trying to understand, latet lev lehavin, to pay attention, to understand the contradictions, and to come up with solutions. So in the time of Rabbi, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Bimei Rabbi nishnet Mishnah zu, this idea, this announcement, go and learn Talmud, that was in the time of Rabbi. So what the people did, Shavku kule alma matnitin, so everyone left the Mishnah, no one learned Mishnayos anymore, ve'azlu batar Talmuda, and they start learning Talmud. I mean, they start developing the Talmud. So when Rabbi saw that, he says, Uleolam hevei ratz la Mishnah yoter min Talmud. So Rabbi says, no. Don't run only for the Talmud to try to understand all the contradictions. If you're going to leave the Mishnah alone, you will not know what you're talking about. Which means basically Rabbi was trying to tell them, hey, try to balance yourself. Because of what? Take a look at Rashi. So they start only thinking, because Rabbi was concerned, because people will start forgetting the Mishnayot, because again, it's not written yet. The Mishnayot here from this Rashi you see for clearly, the Mishnayot are not written. Why? Because if they were written, should Rabbi be concerned that they will forget it? Obviously not. Right? If it's written, even if I forget, I open up the book. So it seems to be that in that time of Rabbi, the Mishnayot were not written yet. That's why Rabbi was concerned that what? That people will forget. V'yachlifu shmot hachachamim, and they will replace the names of the Chachamim. Uvimkom chiyuv yomru ptor, uvimkom asur yomru mutar. So people will be so engaged with what? With thinking and trying to understand the reasons, and then you will ask him, okay, so who is the Tana that says it's chayav? They will not know. And you will ask him, okay, so this Tana says chayav or asur or mutar, and they will forget. So says Rabbi, look, I need to understand the reasons for the Mishnayot and to how to reconcile the contradictions, but at the same time, I also need what? I also need you to remember the names of the Chachamim and the Halachot. So what do we have until now? Before I will open it up for a few questions. We have something very, very interesting when you think about it. You basically say what? You basically say that Rabbi created those files by welcoming or by inviting every scholar that has anything good to say from his Rabbi. He created those files. Those files requires analysis. So he asked them to start analyzing them. And the concern was everyone went to analyze it. And they forgot to what? To continue to repeat the Mishnayot because it was not written. So what did they do? So basically he says to them, you know what? You need to do what? Go back to the Mishnah. Go back to the base. So basically that's how you reconcile the contradiction. On one hand, I want you to analyze the sources. On the other hand, I don't want you to forget the sources. Therefore, we can understand why it says on one hand that the Talmud is the greatest level of learning. On the other hand is what? Run after the Mishnah, because if without the Mishnah, without the basis, you will have nothing. Okay. Anyone, before we continue, questions, comments? Okay, I hope everyone is with me. Okay, just move your hand that you are there. Okay, good.
Rabbi, are there any documents that or manuscripts that were extant from the time of the second century to the 6th century? Is there any evidence that there was written, I don't know what the right word would be, written halachas that were passed on, or manuscripts that people used in that time period? It's pre-printing press. Everything was done by hand.
Okay, so like that. Now I will need to give a little bit of introduction. Yes, they found in the Qumran desert, the Me'arot Qumran, the Qumran caves, they did find, some kind of manuscripts and some kind of writings of some halachot. And some of them belongs to the Isiim and to all kinds of sects, not necessarily Prushim, and some halachot that rabbis wrote to themselves in order not to forget, which is interesting, because don't forget until, and we will see that later, until the time of Rebbe, there was a prohibition to write oral things. So that's one. However, some people did write a little bit, but as a set of Mishnayot, like what we have today, there was, one second, there was nothing like that anywhere. We do have few manuscripts of the Mishnah. It's called Ktav Yad Kaufman, Ktav Yad or Kaufman, Ktav Yad Parma, and Cambridge. 3 of them. Kaufman is the best, and Parma is the second best, and Cambridge is third best. And obviously there are few differences, but all those manuscripts were not written in the time of Rebbe. Okay, they were written much later. At least that's how we date them. And basically, what we have is that we have in the time of Rebbe, and this is why it was so important for me, what Rebbe did, and I'm less interested if he wrote it or not. I don't think he really wrote them, and it seems to be, according to Rashi, it's not. And also, obviously, many researchers basically says the same thing. But the idea is that Rebbe created a revolution. For the first time in history, most of the oral traditions were brought into one place. And Rebbe analyzed them and decided, which is probably the most awesome job and tremendous responsibility. He decided what's get into the files and what is rejected. Some of the rejected opinions made their ways to the Tosefta or maybe to different places, but this is an incredible decision that Rebbe did. You can imagine, what does it mean? So he basically transformed Torah Shebe'al Peh into, rather than everyone is teaching his students and they do whatever they want and there is no Sanhedrin to make decisions, he said we're going to create the principles of Halacha, the principles of Torah Shebe'al Peh, and we are going to do it together. With me, Rabbi, have obviously a little bit more weight in those decisions. Okay, so if there are no questions, we'll go back to the source sheet. Yeah, Phil.
My question's a more basic one. How could you say they're, in principle, they're more important than Mikra? Mikra is supposed to be the divine word of Hashem. Just globally looking at it, what
Phil,
are they?
with all due respect to Hashem, okay? With all due respect to Hashem, without Torah Shebe'al Peh, the Torah Shebichtav will sit in the ark and no one will do anything. We'll be like the Karaim.
Well, then that means that practicality overrules respect.
No, I will say that part of the respect is to come up with this practicality. Hashem
Wow.
wants the Torah Shebichtav, Torah Shebe'al Peh, according to some, okay? I'm not, whatever. The tradition, I'm not going into now, the Torah Shebe'al Peh was also given with Torah Shebichtav. So basically they come together, they compensate each other, they complement each other. Rebbe basically is looking around and he says, look, this Torah Shebichtav, okay, don't forget, you know what, let me take it one step. What Rashi described was very nice, but not 100% accurate. Because we know the 2 generations before Rebbe, they did learn the Mikra, but they developed a different Torah Shebe'al Peh. Who do I mean by that? 2 very famous scholars, Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva. They both created Midrashei Halacha, which means what? What is Midrash Halacha? They take the Psukim, and from the Psukim, they derive Halachot. Okay? So what they did was incredible. Rabbi Akiva Bichlal was so creative. But then what happens? What happened was that they created two schools of thoughts, Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva. And then they created students. And again, they couldn't what? They couldn't find a way to reconcile it. And that's what Rebbe saw 2 generations later. He saw that it seems to be that the Torah from being one becomes now multiple Torah. Everyone does whatever his Rebbe told him. So he decided, you know what, that should come to an end. I'm going to bring it back to one. In a way, what Rebbe says is that if I'm not doing it, Torah shebichtav will be lost. No one will understand exactly the meaning, or at least the most accepted meaning. So that's what Rebbe did. So it is true. The narrative is the basis for everything. It's the basis for Midrashei Halacha and for Midrashei Agadah and for the Mishnah and for the Talmud and for everything. However, what Rebbe says, if you are just trying to only learn Mikra, you will go nowhere, because you will not be able to really decide what is the real interpretation without me. Yes.
Rav
that-
Shai,
Yes.
a question. I'm always worried about the relative importance of the Baraitot. The Baraitot were basically Mishnayot material that Rebbe threw out. He decided not to include them in the Mishnayot. And the way they're brought in the Talmud, you sometimes have the feeling that they're almost just as important, or sometimes even more important than the Mishnayot themselves.
Okay. Who asked the question? I couldn't see.
Okay, I haven't got my picture on. Mike Steiner.
Oh, okay, Mike. So Mike is mentioning the Brightot. So I don't want to go into to give an academic shiur now, even though it might be a good idea one time just to give it. Like I'll call it Talmud 101. You know, just to understand Tosefta, Braita, Mishnah. But Braita from the Aramaic word bara, outside, which means it's a Chomer Tanai, it's a Tanaic source that didn't make it to the Mishnah. The fact that it didn't make it to the Mishnah, at least according to Rashi, we know that Rebbe decided that it's not good enough. It's not good enough. Maybe it was not accurate enough. Maybe it contradicted too many principles that he thought should guide us. But it's the same Chomer Tanai. What the Talmud, for example, does with it, the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, and the Yerushalmi Talmud, they take the Brightot and they question the Mishnah many times, which means it's interesting. Rebbe thought that after his enterprise, that's it, Gamarnu. The Amoraim and the later rabbis brought it back. They said, who are you? With all due respect, you think that you are the only Tana? There are many other Tanaim. Now, Mike, there is so much research on it, and so many articles were written on it. But if you want, you can look how the Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi, and how the Bavli used the Brightot, who used them more accurately, and how they used it. There is a very, very good article. It's in Hebrew, I know. Maybe it was translated into English as well. Of Shama Friedman. I think it's called the Brightot Batalmud Bavli Batalmud Yerushalmi or something like that. I mean, I think you can find it even on Google or on his website. That talks a lot about, you know, what's the status of the Braita, when was it used, what was the level of importance of the Braita. So, I mean, we can go on and on, but we are only in the first source. I don't think we will even be able to complete everything today, but I think it's important because it's Chag Matan Torah. We are going to celebrate Shavuot, and we need to know what we have to celebrate, and we have a lot to celebrate. So, Mike, I hope I addressed a bit of your question. I know that I didn't answer it fully.
Yeah, thank you.
So now let's see. Okay, so now the Gemara says, "My drush," meaning when they thought at the beginning that the Talmud is the greatest thing. So what did they have in mind? Kededarish Rabbi Yehuda beRabbi Eli. My dichtiv, what is the meaning of the pasuk? Haged le'ami pish'am, tell my nation their transgression. Ulebet Yaakov chatatam, and to the house of Jacob tell them about their own transgression as well. Haged le'ami pish'am, what does it mean? Tell my nation their transgressions or their crimes really. אלו תלמידי חכמים, those are the scholars, ששגגות נעשות להם כזדונות. When a Talmid Chacham transgress something even by accident, it's considered like it was intentionally. ולבית יעקב, why? Because we expect him to know. ולבית יעקב חטאתם, and to the house of Jacob their sins, אלו עמי הארץ, those are just the masses, שזדונות נעשות להם כשגגות, that when they do even something intentionally, it becomes unintentionally because they really don't know. והיינו דתנן רבי יהודה אומר, הווה זהיר בתלמוד ששגגת תלמוד עולה זדון, which means the Talmud, and again, not the Talmud as we know it, it's not this one. Talmud meaning לתת לב להבין, to understand, to try to reconcile those contradictions. All those things are very dangerous. What do I mean dangerous? They are dangerous because if you have a mistake, it will cost you not only money, but it will cost you that it will transform into something that you like did intentionally. By the way, as a side note, there are a few mentions to it in the Gemara that if a dayan, if a judge is making a mistake in something that it's shikul hadat, meaning how to think about things, or if he makes a mistake in what we call dvar mishnah, which means what? Something very simple that everyone knows. So the idea is that shigegat Talmud ola zadon, meaning after Rabbi encouraged the people to learn Gemara, okay, he also said to them, be careful. When you learn Gemara, you need to know that if you don't know something, don't make a psak. So now we have a very interesting, I'll call it a very interesting triangle. We have the Mikra, the narrative, which everything derives from it. Then we have the Mishnah, which is gathering all the oral Torah and all the oral tradition into one place and basically categorizing it. And then we have the third stage is analyzing the material, trying to reconcile all those contradictions. And with these three, you want to create what? The halacha. What's the halacha? So this is how it worked. Now, obviously, this is based on Rashi. I can give you a little bit of a different perspective on it, but not now. Basically, what we have is what? Is that we have this connection between Torah shebichtav and Torah shebe'al peh, and also we have a historical junction when the files were created, but just to create files with no analysis, it's nothing. It's a copy-paste. So then the analysis of these files of Mishnayot, this is basically the job of what? And later on. By the way, now I need to tell you something. In the time of the Geonim, we do have testimonies until probably the 9th or 10th century. In Yeshivot HaGeonim, in the Yeshivot of the Geonim in Bavel, in Babylon, they learned by heart to the extent that, if I'm not mistaken, Rav Shrir HaGaon said that if someone will come with a manuscript and says, look, that's what it says, and the Garsan, the guy who repeats it by heart, says that's wrong, who do you think they will prefer? The written manuscript or the guy who is repeating it by heart? בעל פה, נכון מאוד. בעל פה. And they had people who probably had a photographic memory, and they repeated and repeated it, and they were basically the source. Now, before I continue on, because I see the time and I know that I have like 20 more minutes, but I just want to make one point very clear. We are so used to everything is written, or now we Google it and we see it immediately. When you have someone who repeats everything for you, and the only access that you have for this information is through your rabbi, you can imagine the relationships between the student and the rabbi. The student will be with the rabbi 24/7 to hear everything that he says, to document everything that he does. And that was in Tkufat HaGeonim. There were basically altogether maybe 400 people in yeshiva. In most of the time, there were maybe 70 to 100. And basically what they did, they were engaged in repeating and thinking, but the relationship between the student and the rabbi was dependent on him. Without his rabbi, he will not know oral Torah. Today, the entire idea of oral Torah changed since we are writing it. You don't need me to tell you what the Gemara in Baba Metzia in Daf Lamed says. Why? You have the book. You have it on the internet. You don't need me. Which means what's going on now is that after Rebbe created those files, after the analysis, after in the 10th century or 8th century, they start writing it down, it also created some kind of a decline in the commitment, the relationship that the students have with their Talmud, which obviously affected how people learn. On one hand, you create more access for more people to learn. On the other hand, you also create a risk for many people who have no clue how to learn to claim that they know how to learn. You with me? With the risk and the chance? Okay. So now, take a look. Okay, I'll skip a bit. Let's see the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi said something interesting. As I told you before, there's great importance to the Garsanim, to the people who remember things by heart. On the other end, just to repeat things by heart, it's wonderful, but if you don't understand it and you don't know how to analyze it, so whatever. So this is one of the most famous and very interesting disputes. It's brought in the Bavli, but in the Yerushalmi, it's brought in a better way, in my opinion. It says like that, Tani Yerushalmi Masechet Horayot Perek Gimel Halacha Hey. Tani, so there is a Braita. Hasodran Kodem Lepilpelan. What does that mean? Anyone wants the chance to understand it? What does that mean?
Can you hear me?
Paul, yes.
Yeah. Tradition comes before what's written, logic.
I will not say written. Take a look at the Pnei Moshe. Pnei Moshe is Rabbi Moshe Margaliot, who wrote one of the famous, greatest commentaries on Yerushalmi. And he was in the 18th century. Okay, here you have his biography. And he basically says like that, הסודרן, זהו שהמשניות והברייתות סדורים בפיו. Mike, for you, משניות וברייתות. Okay, basically this is someone.
Okay.
The what?
Okay, thank you.
Basically, what is sodran from the word seder? Everything is organized in his mind and his mouth, and he knows the mishnayot and the braitot. Everything is organized. He takes precedent over the pilpelan. What is pilpelan? Not pilpel, not pepper. המפולפל ומחודד ואין הלימוד סדור בפיו כל כך. Meaning, if you ask him for a svara, for a thought, he's great. But he doesn't remember exactly what he's talking about. Okay, he doesn't remember exactly the Mishnayot. He doesn't know their order and how they are in the files, but he's very, very creative. So this source says that if you're talking about who is more important to some extent, so you will say that the guy who is the Sodran, the one who is what? Who is know how to organize all those files and he remembers them, he is better than someone who can just think. Rabbi Shmuel Achoi de Rabbi Brachia. By the way, you know what? Before I'll continue, I just want to tell you that this interesting statement became a divide between the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi yeshivot. I'm not talking about the yeshivot today, but the Sephardi derech in learning is more what?
Sudran.
Is what?
Sudran.
It's more sodran, right? It's to learn a lot of material, to remember it. I mean, for example, you see Rav Ovadia, not that God forbid he doesn't know how to analyze, but you see in his books, it's a lot of material. He remembers so many things. He brings so many opinions. The Ashkenazic derech of limud is more what? Less material, but quote unquote more in depth, more in learning. I mean, there are some yeshivot that, you know, after a year, they maybe finish 10 dapim. That's it. But they know these 10 dapim up and down. So again, what's better, we will talk about it later, but it's an interesting thing that this debate continued on until really the later generations. So then the Yerushalmi says the following. Rabbi Shmuel Achoi de Rabbi Brachia. Rabbi Shmuel, who was Rabbi Brachia's brother, Bai. So he asked, after he heard that the Sodran, the guy who organized the files and knows and remember the Mishnayot and the Braitot is better than the guy who think, he says, Afilu ke Rabbi Ami, even someone like Rabbi Ami. Now, why Rabbi Ami? Says the Pnei Moshe, Afilu ke Rabbi Ami, אם הסודרן שאתה אומר כרבי עמי, שהיו שגורים בפיו, אבל לא כל כך כמו אחרים שהיו בימיו. So he says to him, even Rabbi Ami, I guess, was someone who was able to combine both, to be a Sodran and also to be a Palpelan. אמר להם מתבאי מרבי עמי הוא הפלפלן, הדה אמרה משנה קודם למקרא, ודע מסייע לה. So let's see what Pnei Moshe says. He says, אמר לה, מה את באי מרבי עמי הוא הפלפלן, כלומר, מה אתה אומר מרבי עמי שהרי הוא סיני, ועוקר הרים ומוכתר בשתיהן. עכשיו, this is something interesting. Why is that interesting? Because what the Pnei Moshe does is trying to bring the Bavli into the Yerushalmi. If you remember in the Bavli, what are the names for the guy who remember everything and for the scholar who knows how to think? Sinai ve'oker harim. Sinai is what? Is the one who remembers by heart everything, and the oker harim is the one who thinks and he is creative. In the Yerushalmi, it's called Sodran ve'Palpelan. Okay? The Pnei Moshe brings the Bavli into the interpretation of the Yerushalmi, which I will say, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But however, basically he says to him, no, Rabbi Ami is someone who has both. So really he is a bad example. He's a good example. He knows both. Hada Amara, Mishnah Kodem Lemikra, Veda Messiah Ledetani Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. So now we have a statement from Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai. העוסק במקרא, מידה שאינה מידה. That sounds very similar to what we saw in the Bavli, in this Tanu Rabbanan, right? העוסקים במקרא, מידה ואינה מידה. So here we have Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who basically says, העוסק במקרא, מידה שאינה מידה. So what does that mean? Says the Pnei Moshe, okay, we'll see in a minute. ורבנן עבדין מקרא כמשנה. And Rabbanan equate Mikra and Mishnah together. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman amar Mishnah kodem laTalmud. Says Mishnah is before the Talmud. Uma ta'ama, and what's the reason? Kana chokhma, kne chokhma, kne bina. First, you need to have the knowledge, which is what? The Mishnah or the Talmud?
Mishnah.
Mishnah. And then Bina. What is Bina? to understand one thing from another. Okay, it's like this one. Okay, so Mishnah is the information, the knowledge, and then the Talmud is like that, the Agudal. That's what Rab Shmuel bar Nachman says. Rabbi Yochanan amar Talmud kodem lamishnah, says no, Talmud before the Mishnah. Uma tama, kne chochma, matov mecharutz. Says purchasing wisdom, or knowledge, is better than charutz. What is charutz? Someone who is consistent, is a very matmid. So basically, now let's pause here for a second. What do we have? Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, first and foremost, he says, if you are just engaged in Mikra, not great. Rabbanan says, no, Mikra and Mishnah are pretty the same. And now we have a machloket amoraim, how to define Mishnah and how to define Talmud and what comes first. According to Rav Shmuel bar Nachman, Mishnah comes first and then Talmud. First you need to have the knowledge and then you need to have then a power of analysis. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, Talmud comes first because of what? Talmud is the Chokhmah, and basically Mishnah is just basically being a matmid, meaning someone who now can repeat for me all the Mishnayot by heart. What would you say about him? That he is a Chacham or that he is a Baal Zikaron? What would you say?
Oh, Zikaron.
Exactly, it doesn't say anything about his wisdom. He has maybe a photographic memory, but he can be, sorry, excuse my language, he can be stupid. Yeah, you can have someone who remembers everything, but he doesn't know what he says. So basically what Rabbi Yochanan says, no. First, Talmud, and then you can continue on to start to learn the Mishnah. Now, before I go into this interesting dispute in the Yerushalmi, take a look what the Pnei Moshe says. He says, Hada Amara, Mishnah Kodem Lemikra, Shia Ikar, Liyot Shoked Ba, because this is the most important thing to learn, Ad Shetiyah Mishnah Shgura Befiv, until you know the Mishnah like by heart. Midah she'eina midah, she'ein midah zo ha'ikar, she'amishnah ve'agmara yafim mimena. But some people say, no, ma pitom. Mikra is nice, but Mishnah and Gemara are much better. ורבנן עבדין מקרא כמשנה, שגם על המקרא נוטלים שכר כמו על המשנה. They equate משנה and מקרא. משנה קודם לתלמוד בחשיבות. Okay, so now, here, take a look how he explains Rabbi Yochanan. ומשמעות הכתוב כך הוא, אם קנה חוכמה לבדה, if someone just learned חוכמה by itself, והיא המשנה, מה טוב מחרוץ, והוא הזהב. It's not better than the זהב, לפי שעדיין אין לו מעלת הבינה, והחוכמה נחשבת לו ערכה יותר טובה מזהב. וקנות בינה, כלומר כשהגיע לקנות בינה והוא התלמוד, אז החוכמה אינה חשובה כל כך אצלו, לפי שנתווסף לו מעלת קניין הבינה. ואם כן, אין קניין החוכמה, כי אם נבחר מכסף, לפי ערך הבינה שיותר חשובה במעלה כנגד החוכמה. So basically, he says like that. You know, when you go to Kita Aleph, okay, and you learn how to read, you think that you reached the peak, right? And then you go to Kita Bet and you learn that what? That compared to what you learn in Kita Aleph, yeah, what you learn now in Kita Bet, what you learn in Kita Aleph was nothing, or was not as important but what you learn in Kita Bet. Which means, Rabbi Yochanan, here we have all of that. We basically have a very interesting debate here. It's not only about what to learn first, but it's somewhat of a discussion of what is the goal of your knowledge. Is the goal of your knowledge is just to remember things and to know things, or the goal of your knowledge is to develop it? It's to advance it. You need both, but if someone needs to choose, what does he need to do? And then the Yerushalmi continues, and he says, Ma mekayem Rabbi Yochanan tama de Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman. How Rabbi Yochanan is going to deal with the pasuk that Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman brought. Mayim bezol v'yain biyoker. He says, water is cheap. Wine is expensive. אפשר לעולם לחיות בלא יין, אי אפשר לעולם לחיות בלא מים. He says, look, I understand. If everyone will just learn Talmud and no one will learn Mishnah, the world will not exist. It's like world without water. I understand it. However, I want to suggest, says Rabbi Yochanan, is that you still need wine. You also need wine, and the wine is the Talmud. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, Tama de Rabbi Yochanan, and Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman says, what's the reason of Rabbi Yochanan? Melach, salt, bezol, salt is cheap, pilpelin beyoker, and peppers are expensive. אפשר לעולם לחיות בלא פלפלין, the world can exist without pilpelin, אי אפשר לעולם בלא מלח. That's interesting, right? Basically, what's the debate here? If you send everyone to learn Talmud, everyone is drinking wine, no one drinks water, what will happen? The world will die, which means the masses that cannot reach that level of sophistication, they will die out. They will not know what to do. And Judaism will become only what? Only a place for few people. On the other hand, if you just promote a Mishnah and you promote simple things, you will have no creativity, you will have no sophistication, and yes, it will belong to the masses, but it will dwindle down and people would lose it. So now we have a historical debate of how do you lead the Jewish people? After you created that access for knowledge, do you ask people, encourage people just to focus on the knowledge that they have without any progress and development? Or you say no, you encourage people for development. And then it says, Le'olam meveiratz achar HaMishnah yoter min haTalmud, and then it says that you should run for the Mishnah more than the Talmud. Hada dat mar, like Ada hu deitmar, like this is what it says. Ad shelo shikea bo Rebbe rov mishnayot, אבל מששיקע הרבי רוב משניות לעולם מבירת אחר התלמוד יותר מן המשנה. And this is where the Yerushalmi is not like the Bavli. Basically, the Yerushalmi says the following. He says, look, after Rebbe shikea rov mishnayot, meaning he basically imbued the files of Mishnayot in everyone's heart, now your job is to do what? Talmud. To try to understand and to analyze what the Mishnayot has to say. Just to repeat Mishnayot so you know Mishnayot by heart, it's wonderful, but if it doesn't bring you to advance your learning, that's not enough. So now, what do we have? I'll stop there just because I don't want just to run over the sources. I want us to think about it. We are not just sadranim, we are pilpelin. Okay? So Paul, before I'll take your question. Basically, we see that in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli, we see that there is some kind of a material that basically was in both Talmudim. However, the end conclusion is a bit different. And the perspective on the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Mikra is also a bit different. For example, in the Yerushalmi, we found an opinion, Chachamim, that equate Mishnah and Mikra. We didn't find it in the Bavli. We also saw that when the Gemara in the Bavli tried to understand what's going on there, they said, in the time of Rebbe, they said that you should run after the Talmud, but then he changed his mind. The Yerushalmi says, no. It was after the time of Rebbe, after Rebbe shikea et HaMishnayot, meaning he put his weight over, okay, this is in, this is out, and people got used to it. Then and only after that, you can start really what? Develop Torah Shebe'al Peh even more. Meaning you need to have a rooted base, and from that you can go further. Okay, Paul.
Two things. First of all, the Hasidim never wrote things down. It went from the Rebbe who gave Parshot HaShavua, Divrei Torah, all Baal Peh, and it was only after the war that they started collecting these Rishumot and to finding out the contradictions of what everybody learned from their Rebbe. So that tradition of having non-written Torah as an oral tradition continued. But my thought also was that when the whole thing started, we said Na'aseh v'nishma. First of all, we do things, and then we find out what it means and to explain it. Two thoughts.
That's I mean, it might be a nice thought. I'm not sure that, you know, Na'aseh v'nishma here is a little bit different. Okay, the Na'aseh v'nishma there is basically, okay, we will do and we will hear, and then everyone asks, how can you do things if you don't know even what to do? Okay, so that's, here we are talking about, you know, files that were already gathered. And the question is now what to do. And I will tell you that basically you see in the entire process of the Gemara, you see that this dispute of what kind of learning, what style of learning, what should we do, was something that through the generations was under debate. And sometimes there was a need for more material just for the knowledge, and sometimes there was more for wisdom, and we should find a way to somehow merge them. I think someone else is raising their hand. Is that Stephen?
Yeah, I'm finding it hard not to side with Phil on this. I'm wondering whether it's really helpful to talk of Talmud or Mishnah being more important than Mikra. You know, we all know that at the time of the Maskilim, many of them were great Talmudists, and they learnt Gemara as an intellectual exercise and got a lot of pleasure and joy out of it, but they weren't really interested so much in Mikra. I see it not in terms of, you know, if you have a choice as to whether you're going to learn Torah, Mikra, or Talmud, you should always opt for Talmud, because without that grounding in Mikra, and without your spiritual and faith commitment to Mikra, then Talmud can be just, as I say, like an advanced crossword puzzle.
I would say like that. Obviously, there is a danger in learning just Talmud for the cognitive satisfaction and advancement, which some people do, and they have nothing to do with faith and everything. But don't forget, in the time of the Talmud, it was a little bit different. And B, I do believe that some people wanted to opt out to just Mikra because it was just easier. And the Gemara is trying to push you and encourage you to become a scholar. That's A. B, I think that also the Mikra was always the basis, because when you learn Midrashei Halacha or even Mishnayot, obviously they are trying to understand the Mikrot. The thing is that just don't get engaged in just Mikra, but you must learn and immerse yourself in the quote unquote the new stage, which means the Mishnah and the Talmud, because without them you will not understand the Mikra. Meaning the time that people could read the pasuk and know the halacha immediately, it's over. The only way to know what Hashem wants you to do is through the Mishnah and the Talmud. Now, also I will just in conclusion, when I'm going to conclude, is just also I want you to know that when we say Talmud, we're not necessarily talking about Talmud Bavli now or Yerushalmi. We are talking about Latet Lev Lehavin, meaning to give the thought, the proper thought of understanding of what's going on. So, in conclusion, my encouragement to all of you is Gam mizeh v'gam mizeh al tanach yadecha. Okay, which means be engaged with Mikra, with Mishnah and Talmud. Be Sinai and Okerarim, be Sodran and Palpelanim. Do it all. But just to understand the stages and the importance of each one of them. And each one of them is based on the top of the other. And we all understand that, you know, someone can start thinking and developing, but if there is no basis, okay, if there is nothing that he can rely on, he can say whatever he wants from now until tomorrow, but if it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. So there's really this balancing act between all these three stages, I would say, or interpretations, or developments that we have, the Mikra, the Mishnah, and the Talmud. And we also saw that through the generations, there was a debate. Now, you have the source sheet, so if not, the Torah Mitzion can obviously send it to you. and look over it on Shavuot. There is a very interesting Gemara in Horayot that you should compare to the Yerushalmi, and also Rabbi Menachem Ameiri, who lived in the 14th century in Provence or Perpignan. So that's it for today. I would like to wish everyone Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. Also, this Thursday, we don't have the Midrash Shiur. I know that many of you attend. We have the recording from Beit Avichai that I did. It will be aired out at 8. You need to just sign up for the link, I think. And I'll see some of you over Shabbat and Shavuot. So everyone, have a wonderful day. Shabbat Shalom and
Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach.
Yeah.